Garrett Mulcahy slammed his glass down on the wooden table hard enough to silence the whole private room. "What is that waitress exactly?" His voice was hoarse, loud enough for all 7 men to hear him clearly. "I held the Ferrante boy before he could walk. 19 years I served his father. And now I sit here and let some girl carrying plates pour my coffee?" He laughed, that dry laugh that had made men twice his size look away. "This place is empty every night. Let the dishwasher stay late and we'll handle it then." Nobody objected. At the Cormorant, nobody objected to Garrett Mulcahy. But nobody in that room knew the service window between the kitchen and the private room was open, and Marin Holloway was standing on the other side of it, polishing a glass, her eyes fixed on his mouth. She was 27 years old, worked 2 shifts a day, and her mother had never heard a single sound in her life. She read every word off Garrett Mulcahy's lips. She set the glass down, smiled at table 4, took the order pad out of her apron pocket, and wrote exactly 2 lines. What Garrett Mulcahy did not know was that for 9 years, every Saturday at 7 in the morning, she drove down to an old garage in Dundalk, where an elderly man taught her things he swore she would never need. 9 years, and she had never once needed them. 10 weeks later, at 11:40 at night, 3 men would come through the delivery door of that restaurant, and Garrett Mulcahy told them only one thing about her: "That girl is not a factor." It was the most expensive sentence of his life. If you were her, standing alone in that dark kitchen, knowing everything and saying nothing, what would you do? If you love stories about quiet people nobody sees coming, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss next week's story. If this opening made you want to hear the rest, leave a like. It helps this story reach more people. And if you have ever been underestimated by someone, share this video with a person who needs to hear it today. Marin finished her shift at 1 o'clock in the morning. She hung her apron on the hook, slipped her order pad into the pocket of her coat, and walked to the bus stop through the early September cold along the harbor. There were only 3 people on the bus, and every one of them was dozing. She didn't sleep. She sat upright for the entire 20-minute ride and thought about the 2 lines she'd just written, and about the way Garrett Mulcahy had said those final words, the way he'd spoken about the woman washing dishes as though he were talking about a chair that needed to be removed from a room. 6 hours later, she parked her old car outside a garage in Dundalk. 7 o'clock Saturday morning. The rolling door was already raised, the fluorescent lights were already on, and the old training mat had been spread across the concrete floor. Beryl, Gus's 12-year-old dog, lay curled in a corner near the electric heater, and didn't even bother lifting his head when she walked in. Gus Pryor was 76, standing beside the wooden boat he was still restoring, a piece of sandpaper in one hand. He didn't ask how the night before had gone. He never did. He simply set the sandpaper down on the edge of the boat and said 2 words: "Get in position." 9 years earlier, when she was 18, she'd worked her first night shift at a diner on Eastern Street and come home at 2 o'clock in the morning. She hadn't told him. He'd known anyway. That Saturday, he'd called without saying hello, without explaining a thing, and told her to be at the garage at 7 o'clock in the morning, not to eat breakfast first, then hung up. She went, and she had gone at 7 o'clock every Saturday morning for the next 9 years. That first morning, he'd switched off the fluorescent lights and told her to stand still in the middle of the dark garage. "Count," he'd said. "Count to 120. She counted. Somewhere around 90, things in the darkness began to take shape. The edge of the boat, the door frame, the cold workbench, even Beryl's water bowl. 2 minutes, he said from somewhere in the dark. You stand in darkness for 2 minutes. Your eyes open up, and you see what they don't. They come in from the light. They'll be blind for 6 seconds. Those 6 seconds belong to you." He turned the lights back on and never said another word about it. That morning he had her repeat a drill she'd done hundreds of times. He stepped toward her, and she stepped back to the left instead of the right. "Wrong," he said. "You just thought. Don't think. Let your feet remember." She did it again. He wrapped a hand around her wrist and tightened his grip, and instinctively she pulled against him. He let go. "You're trying to beat me," he said. "You can't beat me with strength. You follow the force. You let it take you where you want to go." Then he pointed toward the tool cart against the wall. "And you don't strike to finish it. You strike to change the situation. One hit that makes his hand come off his belt is enough." She nodded. She'd heard that sentence so many times it no longer sounded like a lesson. It sounded like something a person said while pouring coffee. At the end of the session, she sat on the edge of the boat while he handed her a cup of tea. "You missed 2 beats on the 3rd round, he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "You're thinking about something else." He looked at her for a while. He didn't ask what that something else was. "When you make a mistake, don't waste time on the mistake," he said. "Spend your time on what comes next." Beryl shifted in his corner. Outside, the fog rising off the bay still hadn't completely burned away. On Sunday, she took the bus to Catonsville. Des was 25, sitting in the common room beside the window, and every time she came, he recognized her in a different way. Some days he said her name immediately. Some days he stared at her for a long while before he smiled. Today was the second kind of day. She sat beside him and told him about the customers from the week, about the old man at table 9 who ordered exactly the same thing every week, and then changed his mind at the last second, about the young married couple who spent 30 minutes arguing over whether they should order dessert, and finally ordered 2. Des laughed. He wasn't laughing because of the story. She knew that. He laughed because of her voice, because of the rise and fall of it, the rhythm he'd heard since he was very small, the one thing in all of her that the fever that year hadn't taken away from him. She stayed until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. On the bus ride home, she sat with one hand inside her coat pocket, her fingers resting against the cover of her order pad. For 9 years, she'd driven down to that garage every Saturday morning. For 9 years, she'd practiced the things the old man told her she would never have to use. And for 9 years, she'd never used them once. She kept them the way people keep a fire extinguisher in the kitchen, not because they believe there will be a fire, but because the cost of not having it, on the one night when it's needed, is a price no one can afford to pay. At the Cormorant restaurant, there was a rule no one had ever written down and no one ever needed to repeat. Private room 2 belonged to one person only. It couldn't be reserved, it didn't take walk-in guests, and it never appeared in the reservation book. When the light in that room came on a Tuesday night, everyone in the kitchen knew something was happening, and no one said the name of the man sitting inside. People called him Sir, or the guest in room 2, or they said nothing at all. Marin had worked there for 4 years and had never once heard an employee speak that name aloud. That alone was information, and she'd filed it away in her mind during her second week on the job. 3 weeks after the night Garrett Mulcahy slammed his glass onto the table, she got the first piece. On a Tuesday evening, she was standing at the service window stacking plates when, inside the private room, Mulcahy leaned to his right and spoke to the person beside him. She couldn't hear anything. The dishwasher drowned it all out, but she saw his mouth. After the port contract is signed, that was all. When he finished, he leaned back and laughed at someone seated at the far end of the table. She finished stacking the plates, went into the dishwashing area, pulled out her order pad, and wrote one line in the kind of shorthand every server had and no 2 servers shared, clipped letters, slashes, numbers standing in for dishes. She'd been using it for 8 years. If anyone picked up that pad, they'd see exactly what they expected to see inside a waitress's apron pocket. The second piece came 8 days later. This time it was a name, Teddy. Mulcahy said it twice in the same sentence, and the second time he lowered his voice. She could see it clearly in the way his jaw tightened. None of the 7 people around the table was named Teddy. She wrote another line. Between those 2 pieces came 11 ordinary days. She carried plates, polished glasses, remembered the orders of more than 200 customers without looking at her pad, and did what Gus had taught her to do with everything in life, which was wait. One moment isn't evidence, he'd told her in the garage on some Saturday morning years ago, back when he still told her stories about his old job at the insurance company. Everybody has one bad moment. A pattern is evidence. Don't force the meaning to show itself. Let it show itself. During those 3 weeks, other things happened too, and Marin didn't think any of them had anything to do with one another. Perla Quintanilla took her down the back hallway to show her the breaker box because the lights in the cold kitchen had been flickering the week before, and Perla didn't want to have to climb up there alone again. She'd been washing dishes at the Cormorant for 16 years, and she knew that building better than anyone alive. "This is the east half," she said, pointing to the 3rd switch from the top. Kitchen, dry storage, delivery door, back hallway. Marin remembered it. She remembered everything. That was her job. Perla also complained about the convenience store on the corner. It had just changed its hours and now closed at 11 o'clock at night, while her shift ended at 11:15. She said she'd have to walk another 4 blocks just to buy a packet of tea. Marin told her to take tea from the restaurant's supply. Perla said she didn't take other people's things. During those same 3 weeks, Dinah Roscoe scheduled Marin for 2 morning shifts in a row so she could have the entire Sunday free to go to Catonsville. Dinah was the night manager, 44 years old. And 4 years earlier, during the months Des had been in the hospital, she was the one who'd covered Marin's shifts for 7 straight weeks without asking a single question, without saying a word to anyone, and without ever bringing it up again. Marin had never forgotten that. And every Saturday night, one family came in for dinner, a father, a mother, and a little girl about 6 years old, who always sat in the innermost seat. The girl never finished her meal because she was too busy drawing on the paper tray liner. That week she drew a purple fish with 4 legs, folded the picture in half, handed it to Marin, and said, "This is you." Marin asked why the fish had legs. The little girl said, "Because you walk a lot." The whole table laughed. Marin laughed too, and she thanked the girl with great seriousness, then carried the drawing into the kitchen and tucked it inside her order pad, between pages of shorthand no one ever bothered to glance at. The third piece came on the night Mulcahy slammed down his glass. It was the piece she'd had from the beginning. She simply hadn't known where it belonged. Leave the dishwasher here and deal with her afterward. 3 weeks later, sitting in the dishwashing area at 1 o'clock in the morning, with her order pad open across her lap, she placed the 3 lines beside one another and looked at them. A port contract, a name that didn't belong in that room, and a sentence about a 58-year-old woman whose shift ended at 11:15. 3 separate moments, happening days apart, none of them proving anything at all. She sat there for a very long time. Then she closed the order pad, and for the first time in 4 years of working at that restaurant, she was afraid. For the next 4 days, Marin kept telling herself that this wasn't her business. She repeated it to herself on the bus, while stacking glasses, while lying awake staring at the ceiling at 3 o'clock in the morning. Who the man sitting in private room 2 was, how he made his money, whether he lived or died. None of that had anything to do with a woman who waited tables 2 shifts a day and still had $180,000 in hospital bills to pay. If Garrett Mulcahy wanted to take something from him, that was between the 2 of them, and the world wouldn't become any poorer or any richer because of it. She believed that argument, and it held for 4 days. What it couldn't hold against was the final sentence. Leave the dishwasher here and deal with her afterward. Perla Quintanilla was 58 years old, worked a shift that ended at 11:15, wouldn't take a packet of tea from the restaurant because she didn't take other people's things, and in 16 years no one at the Cormorant had ever asked her a single question about herself. Thursday night, it rained. Not hard, just the kind of September rain Baltimore got, wet enough to be unpleasant, and not heavy enough to make anyone run. Marin carried a tray of dirty glasses into the dishwashing area, and through the window in the back hallway, she saw that the light in private room 2 had gone dark. She stood there for 4 seconds. Then she set the tray down, went out through the side door, and stepped into the parking lot behind the restaurant, still wearing her apron, without putting on anything else. He was walking from the back door toward the black car parked near the wall. It was the first time she'd seen him from less than 10 feet away. 34 years old, tall, black hair already graying early at both temples, and he walked with the slightest limp in his left leg, the kind of thing a person only noticed if they were used to noticing. The woman walking beside him was Nell Prokop. Marin had seen her a few times before, always half a step ahead, and always holding a phone. Marin stopped about 13 feet away and called out, "Mr. Ferrante." They both turned. Nell Prokop stepped forward once, the kind of step taken by someone who was paid to step forward first. Aurelio Ferrante didn't move. He simply stood still and looked at her, and she could see him doing exactly what she did with every customer who walked into the restaurant, reading her in 2 seconds and filing her into a category. Apron, waitress, harmless. Rain clung to the shoulders of his coat. Marin said only one sentence. "Don't sign the port contract in November. At least not when Garrett Mulcahy knows the date." Then she turned and walked straight back through the side door without waiting for an answer, without looking back, and the door closed behind her. She went into the dishwashing area, picked up the tray of glasses, and began loading them into the machine. Her hands were shaking. She let them shake until they stopped. Then she kept working. Outside, Aurelio Ferrante was still standing exactly where she'd left him. He didn't go to the car. He didn't say anything. He stood in the rain for 20 seconds, his right hand turning the ring on his little finger, his mother's ring, the one he twisted when he was calculating something and didn't want anyone to know he was calculating. Nell Prokop opened the car door, waited, then asked, "What was that about?" He looked at the closed side door. "Nothing," he said. Then he got into the car. On the drive back to Greenspring Valley, he didn't say a word. And Nell, who had worked with him for 6 years, didn't ask again, because she knew which of his silences were closed and which were still running. This was the second kind. He thought about 3 things. The first was the date of the port contract signing, a date only 4 people in the entire organization knew, and he knew exactly who those 4 people were. The second was the way she'd said Garrett Mulcahy's name, without lowering her voice, without fear, without the hesitation of someone passing along gossip, but in the flat tone of a person reading back a line from a ledger. The third, and this was the one he kept turning over longest, was that she hadn't asked for anything. People came to him to ask. That was the only thing people did when they came to him. They brought information and then stood there waiting. And that waiting was the real point of the entire exchange. She'd finished speaking and walked away before he'd even had the chance to open his mouth. 3 days later, he called Nell into his office and told her to have someone review the entire schedule for the port contract signing, who had been informed, when they had been informed, through what channel, and who had seen the draft before the final version. Nell asked if something was wrong. He said, "Nothing. Just check it." She stood there for one more beat, then nodded and left. She'd heard him say nothing enough times over 6 years to know that it was the word he used when something was very wrong. Maren, meanwhile, knew absolutely nothing about any of it during those 3 days. She carried plates, polished glasses, worked morning shifts and evening shifts, and believed she'd done her part. She'd spoken. She'd warned him. The rest belonged to someone else now. It would take another 7 weeks before she understood that in that world, once you'd opened your mouth and said one sentence, you were no longer an outsider. They came at 9:10 on Tuesday morning, which was exactly the time when someone working 2 shifts a day had managed to get only 4 hours of sleep. Maren opened the door wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair still loose, and standing in the hallway were 2 people, 1 man and 1 woman, both in dark coats, both raising their badges at the same time, with the practiced motion of people who had done it many times before. The woman introduced herself as Ruiz. The man didn't say a word for the first 15 minutes. They asked whether she'd mind if they came inside. She said yes, she would mind. They came in. The Highlandtown apartment had only 1 room, 1 dining table pushed up against the kitchen, and 2 chairs. So Maren took one while Ruiz sat in the other and the man leaned against the refrigerator. Ruiz placed a file on the table but didn't open it right away. She said they were investigating the Ferrante organization, specifically its Baltimore port transportation operations, and that they were speaking to every employee at the Cormorant restaurant. Then she gave Maren the number. She was number 9. Maren would remember that very clearly afterward, the way Ruiz said the number with complete indifference, as though she were calling a ticket number at the meat counter. She wasn't special. She wasn't a target. She was the 9th line on a list printed from the timekeeping system. Then Ruiz opened the file and placed a photograph on the table. It had been taken from across the street, through the restaurant window, slightly blurred and slightly tilted. In the picture, Maren was carrying a tray of coffee through the doorway of private room 2. The door was open. Inside, 3 men could be seen sitting around the table. Ruiz didn't say anything about the photograph. She simply left it there. It was a technique Maren had seen a few times in her life. Not in court, but in the restaurant itself, when someone wanted you to say something on your own before they had to ask. She looked at the photograph for about 3 seconds, then raised her eyes and said, "I was bringing in coffee." Ruiz said she knew. Then she told her the rest. Private room 2 had no security camera. Over the past 14 months, 41 meetings had taken place there, and in 38 of those 41 meetings, the same person had carried food and drinks into the room. She said that number in the same tone she'd used to call out Maren's place in line. The man leaning against the refrigerator spoke for the first time. He said she wasn't being accused of anything. She only needed to tell them what she'd heard. Maren said, "I didn't hear anything. The dishwasher is loud." Ruiz nodded as though that were a perfectly reasonable answer, then pulled out a second sheet of paper and slid it across the table. A subpoena. The court date was printed in the upper right corner, a Wednesday in December. Ruiz said that if Maren appeared in court and told the truth, there wouldn't be any problem. If she appeared in court and didn't tell the truth, or if she told anyone about this conversation, that would be obstruction, and obstruction was a federal crime. She left her business card on the table beside the photograph, and the 2 of them walked out. The door closed at 9:51. Maren remained sitting in the chair for another 10 minutes. Then she stood, walked to the small cabinet beside the bed, and pulled open the second drawer. Inside was a stack of bills. She'd been arranging them by due date for 3 years and had never changed the order. The ones that had to be paid first on top, the ones that could wait underneath. Hospital, ambulance, 40 days in intensive care. Then Catonsville, 1 bill every month, steady as a heartbeat. Altogether, after everything she'd paid over 4 years, she still owed $180,000. Dez's place in Catonsville depended on the group insurance plan she received by working enough hours at the Cormorant. That was the entire reason she worked 2 shifts. It wasn't for the wages. It was for the insurance coverage. She sat on the edge of the bed with the stack of papers in her lap and began calculating. If she went to court and testified about what she'd read on Garrett Mulcahy's lips, Within a week, all of Baltimore would know who had testified. She'd lose her job the next day. Lose the job, lose the insurance, and Des would lose his place in Catonsville, and nowhere else would take him for anything close to what she could afford. If she went to court and said she hadn't heard anything, she'd be lying in federal court, with a photograph in the file proving she'd been inside that room 38 times. If she stayed silent and didn't appear, that was obstruction. She started the calculation over from the beginning, then she did it again. In 3 years of making a living by remembering orders, she'd learned that when a problem wouldn't come out right, it was usually because you were missing a piece of information, not because you'd done the math wrong. But that night she sat there until morning, and she couldn't find any missing piece at all. She found only one thing, and it was colder than anything she'd thought during the past 4 weeks. For all those 4 weeks, she'd believed she was standing outside looking in. It turned out she'd been inside all along, beginning 38 visits ago. 6 days later, Nell Prokop was standing at the restaurant's side door at 11 o'clock at night, telling Marin that a car was waiting in the back lot. Marin asked, "What if I don't go?" Nell said then she'd stand there until Marin changed her mind, and she'd waited in far worse places. The house in Greenspring Valley was a 40-minute drive away. They took her into a room with a long table, and 3 people were already seated there. Aurelio Ferrante sat at the head of the table. Nell was on the left, and there was a silver-haired man with a thin file who introduced himself as the family's attorney and didn't give his name. He explained everything in 6 minutes, without wasting a single word. He knew about the 2 federal agents. He knew the date written on the subpoena. He knew she was number 9. And he even knew the number 38 that Ruiz herself had read aloud to her. Then he put the offer on the table, a civil marriage. In exchange, every expense for Des Holloway's care in Catonsville would be covered for the rest of his life through an independent trust, regardless of where Marin worked, regardless of how long the marriage lasted. The $180,000 in hospital debt would be paid within 10 days, and she would be protected. He didn't explain what protected meant. Marin looked at Aurelio Ferrante. He hadn't said a word since she'd entered the room. She asked him, "Why?" He folded his hands on the tabletop. "You said one sentence to me in a parking lot," he said. 3 days later, I had the schedule checked. "You were right." He paused for one beat. "Now there are 2 federal agents who know you've been inside that room 38 times. If I leave you out there alone, you won't survive December, and it won't be because of me." Marin asked, "And what do you get?" He didn't evade the question. "I get someone inside my house who wasn't chosen for me," he said. "I get time, and I buy the thing you're selling without knowing you're selling it, which is that you see things other people don't see." He looked directly at her. "I'm not going to tell you this is something beautiful. This is a transaction. You get protection, your brother is cared for the rest of his life, and I get what I need. Neither one of us has to pretend it's anything else." Marin sat motionless. She looked at the thin file on the table. She thought about the second drawer in the cabinet beside her bed, about the order she'd kept by due date for 3 years. She thought about Des sitting beside the window in Catonsville, and how on some Sundays he recognized her immediately, while on others he had to look at her for a long time. She thought about how, for 4 years, she hadn't once been given the luxury of choosing between 2 good things. She counted. It was an old habit. 40 seconds. The whole room waited. Nell Prokop checked her watch once, and then stopped. Then Marin looked up and asked exactly one question. "If I say no, will you still pay for Des?" "No," Aurelio said. Immediately, without hesitation, without apology. "No." She nodded slowly. "Then at least you're honest," she said. The attorney uncapped his pen. 3 days later, 9 o'clock Friday morning, Baltimore City Hall. The sky was clear, and the air was cold. Marin wore the same coat she wore to work because she didn't own another one, and she arrived by bus because she was used to taking the bus. No flowers, no photographs. The 2 witnesses were 2 of Nell's people, whom Marin had never met and would never see again. The clerk read the required Maryland language in the voice of someone who'd read it 4,000 times. The entire thing lasted 9 minutes. She knew because she counted. When it was over, Aurelio Ferrante turned to her and held out his hand. Not to hold hers, to shake it. She looked at that hand for 1 second, then took it. The handshake of 2 people who had just concluded a negotiation. Firm, brief, lasting no more than a beat. "The car is waiting," he said. Outside on the steps of City Hall, another couple was taking wedding photographs with 20 relatives gathered around them. Someone was throwing rice, and laughter broke out. Marin walked past them without slowing and got into the car. On the drive back to Greenspring Valley, she sat in the back seat with one hand inside her coat pocket, her fingers touching the cover of her order pad. She'd brought it with her. She hadn't thought about it. She simply never left home without it. Inside the pad, tucked between pages of shorthand, the drawing of the purple fish with 4 legs was still there. She thought, today is Friday. Tomorrow is Saturday. At 7 o'clock in the morning, she still had to be at the garage in Dundalk, and she was going to have to figure out how to tell Gus Pryor. The first dinner took place on Tuesday evening the following week, and Marin understood the moment she stepped into the dining room that it wasn't really a dinner at all. It was a presentation. A long table, 8 places, 7 people already seated. Nell Prokop sat to Aurelio's right and didn't stand when Marin entered. The man at the opposite end of the table was an old man with white hair, 61 years old, wearing a V-neck sweater, and he was the only person who rose. Arturo Fiore, he said, and he took her hand in both of his, warmly, holding it exactly 1 beat longer than necessary. He said he was very pleased. He said it had been a very long time since anyone new had lived in this house. He asked whether she found the room on the 2nd floor comfortable, and he told her that if she needed anything, she should tell Nell. He was so polite that Marin had to notice. In 4 years of waiting tables, she'd learned that the right amount of politeness passed by without anyone remembering it, while too much politeness always had a reason behind it, and that reason was usually hiding wherever someone was trying to compensate for something they didn't want anyone else to see. She thanked him and sat down. Nell Prokop was the exact opposite. She hid nothing. During the meal, she looked at Marin 3 times, and all 3 were direct looks, without evasion, the look of someone taking inventory. Halfway through dinner, she asked without any preamble what Marin intended to do about her shifts at the Cormorant. Marin said, "I'm still going to work." Nell said, "Why?" Marin said, "Because I don't know how to do anything else, and because if I quit right now, everyone there will write their own story about why, and the story people write for themselves is always worse than the truth." Nell looked at her for another 2 seconds, then turned and began talking to Aurelio about something else. It was the first moment that evening when Marin felt she'd scored a small point. Garrett Mulcahy sat 3 seats away from her. He arrived 10 minutes late, pulled out his chair, sat down, and while he unfolded his napkin, he looked at her. Half a second. Marin knew that look very well because she'd been receiving it all her life. The inventory first, then the devaluation. The decision made before a single word had been exchanged. Then he lowered his eyes to his wine glass and didn't look at her again. For 40 minutes he talked to Arturo Fiore about container prices, about a freight company in Norfolk, about the weather. He addressed Aurelio with a tone precise down to every word, and that precision was half a beat slower than natural, like a man performing loyalty for some invisible audience while keeping a separate ledger inside his own head. Marin ate and listened. She said very little. At the end of the meal, when everyone began getting to their feet, Mulcahy walked past her chair and stopped. He didn't bend down. He spoke to the glass in his hand, quietly enough that only she could hear, and loudly enough that he couldn't deny having said it. "I don't know what the hell you are." Then he walked out. Marin set down her napkin, thanked Arturo Fiore, wished everyone good night in the same voice she used to wish the guests at table 4 a pleasant meal, and went upstairs. In her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, pulled out her order pad, and wrote 3 lines. The first was about Arturo Fiore and the 2-handed handshake. The second was about Nell Prokop and the direct question, beside which Marin added a small plus sign, because in her experience, people who asked direct questions were usually the easiest people in the room to read, and therefore the least dangerous. The third line contained only 2 words and a question mark. Half second? Because what he'd done tonight didn't match what he'd said 5 weeks earlier in private room 2. In the private room, he'd slammed his glass down, he'd raised his voice. He'd needed 7 people to hear him. Tonight he'd given her half a second, and then gone silent. People didn't grow quiet when they despised someone. They grew quiet when they started calculating. She closed the pad and lay down. She couldn't sleep. At 1:30 in the morning, she was still lying there staring at the ceiling, and she realized the problem wasn't Mulcahy, and it wasn't the unfamiliar room. It was the silence. For 4 years she'd slept with the sound of traffic outside in Highlandtown, the neighbor opening a door, the sound of ship horns drifting up from the harbor near dawn. In Greenspring Valley, there was nothing at all. That silence had a price attached to it, and she wasn't used to being somewhere that expensive. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she got up. She went downstairs, walked through the dark hallway, and found the kitchen. She switched on the small light above the sink, opened the refrigerator, and began doing the only thing she knew how to do when her mind refused to stop. She had already cracked the eggs into a bowl and was stirring onions in the pan when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He didn't say anything for about 5 seconds, and she knew he was standing there before she turned around, because the small light over the sink cast his shadow long across the floor. She kept stirring. "I've used up all the eggs in the house," she said. He came into the kitchen and pulled out a chair on the other side of the island. "No one in this house cooks at 2 o'clock in the morning," he said. "Someone does now," she said. He looked at the pan. She tilted it, pushed the onions to one side, poured the eggs into the empty space, and didn't look down once. She watched the surface of the pan, watched the edges of the eggs, watched the way the color changed around them. "My mother cooked this way," she said. She couldn't hear the oil sizzling. People cook with their ears more than they realize. The sizzle, the sound of water cooking away, rice boiling over. She didn't have any of that. She cooked with her eyes. She watched the edges. She watched the color. She watched where the steam rose first, and where it rose afterward. She taught me her way because she didn't know how to teach any other way. Aurelio was quiet for a while. "Did she read lips too?" he said. "No," Marin said. "She taught me." She turned off the stove, divided the eggs between 2 plates without asking whether he wanted any, and slid 1 plate across the island. He looked at it, then he picked up his fork. "No one in this house cooks for me at 2 o'clock in the morning anymore," he said. "You already said that," she said. He ate. After a while he asked, "How old is your brother?" 25, she said. He didn't ask anything else. He simply waited. And Marin recognized it as the technique of a man who had sat at the head of a long table many times. He didn't pull information out of people. He opened a space and left it there, to see whether they would step into it on their own. She hadn't intended to step into it. Then she did, and she didn't understand why, except that it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and she was sitting in a house she'd never imagined she would sleep in. 5 years ago, she said. Des was 20 then. I was working double shifts 3 days in a row. Mornings at the diner on Eastern Street, evenings at the Cormorant, getting home at 1 o'clock, sleeping 4 hours. She set down her fork. He had a fever. I thought it was the flu. It was February. Everyone in the city had the flu, and 4 people in the restaurant kitchen had it too. I bought fever medicine at the corner store and told him to take it, and I went to work. The second day, his fever was still high, and I still went to work. The third day, he couldn't get up anymore. She looked at the small light above the sink. 40 hours, she said. He got to the hospital 40 hours late. Bacterial meningitis. The doctor said if he'd come in during the first 24 hours, there probably would have been almost no lasting damage. He recovered, but not completely. She fell silent. Aurelio didn't say anything. He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. He didn't say anyone would have thought it was the flu. He didn't say any of the things Marin had expected, and had already prepared a polite nod to receive. He set down his fork and said only one thing. You're still working 2 shifts a day. Marin looked up. In 4 years, no one had ever said that to her. People had comforted her. People had told her not to blame herself. And every one of those words had slid over her like water on glass because none of them touched the real place. What he'd just said did. It neither forgave her nor condemned her. It simply pointed to a truth she'd been living inside for 5 years and had never given a name. She was still paying. She had been paying with the exact thing that had caused it in the first place. 2 shifts a day. And she'd never stopped long enough to ask herself whether she was trying to repay a debt no one had demanded, and that could never be paid off. She didn't answer him. She stood and carried both plates to the sink. My father was the same, she said as she turned on the faucet. He worked at the port. He had a pocket watch that he never kept in his pocket. He always left it on the dining table, and he used to say that any watch you carry in your pocket becomes your boss's watch too. He died when I was 9. She turned the water up harder. He didn't ask anything else about the watch. She didn't say anything more either. When she finished washing and turned around, he was already on his feet. At the kitchen door, he paused for one beat. Tomorrow Nell will give you a list of the people coming to dinner this week, he said. Read it, then tell me what you see. 4 days later, Nell Prokop led her down to the study on the ground floor and closed the door from the outside. A laptop was already open on the desk. Aurelio sat on the other side and didn't invite her to sit. He simply pushed the computer toward her. Watch this, he said. The footage was 1 minute and 40 seconds long. The security camera was mounted high, angled downward, the image black and white, with no sound. 2 men stood inside a warehouse, one with his back turned 3/4 toward the camera, the other facing it. There was no date in the corner of the screen, no file name. Someone had cut exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds from something longer, and removed everything that might tell her who these people were, or where they were. Marin understood immediately that this was a test. She watched the entire clip once without saying anything. Then she dragged the timeline back to the beginning and watched it a second time, pausing 4 times, 3 when the man facing the camera turned his head away, and once when the light flared across the image. When she was finished, she pushed the laptop back to the middle of the desk. "I can't read the man with his back to us," she said. "I only see his face for about 2.5 seconds in the whole clip. That's not enough. The other man I can read, except for the 3 places where he turns away and the one where the light washes him out." She continued in an even voice, neither fast nor slow, exactly the tone she used when repeating an order back to the kitchen. "He says he needs more time. The other man asks something, and he says it isn't a question of time. It's a question of the number. Then he says 2.4. She paused. "Not 2.4 million, she said. "He only says 2.4. People only leave out the word million when both sides have already talked about it enough times that they know what it means. After that, he says a sentence where I only catch the first half. The meaning is that if they touch it now, that entire side of the operation will be exposed. Then he says after November. I lose the final sentence because he turns away." Aurelio said nothing. He picked up the laptop, typed a few keys, and turned it back toward her. "There are 3 more clips," he said. "These are longer and they haven't been cut. They have dates. They have file names. They have sound too, but the compression is damaged, so all that's left is a low hum." Marin watched all 3 over the next 35 minutes, reading each one piece by piece, stopping whenever she lost the thread, making it clear which parts she was certain about and which parts she was guessing. She told him she never guessed more than 2 words in a row. That was her rule. More than 2 words, and it was no longer reading. It was inventing. In the second clip, the name Teddy appeared twice, and Marin recognized it immediately because she'd already written it in her order pad 6 weeks earlier. In the third clip, the man facing the camera said one short sentence, and then laughed. Marin stopped the recording, rewound it, and watched it twice more. Then she said, "He won't be there after Thanksgiving." She looked up. "I'm certain about this sentence. I didn't guess a single word." Aurelio Ferrante sat motionless. He didn't ask her to repeat it. He didn't tell her to watch it again. He sat there for a very long time, his right hand turning the ring on his little finger, his eyes fixed on the surface of the desk instead of the screen, and Marin left him alone because she'd learned a long time ago that when someone had just been handed bad news, the kindest thing you could do was stay quiet. Finally, he said, "Who else knows you can do this?" "No one," she said. He looked at her. "No one?" "No one," she repeated. "People know I'm good at remembering orders. People compliment me on how well I remember orders. That's all." She gave the smallest shrug. No one ever asked. Aurelio closed the laptop. Then he said something she hadn't been prepared for. 9 months ago, someone came to me and said there was a traitor inside the organization, he said. That person came before anyone else did. He gave me 3 reasons, and 1 name. Marin waited. The name was Arturo Fiore, he said. The person who gave me the name was Garrett Mulcahy. Marin didn't say anything for several seconds. Then she asked, "Did you believe him?" "I believed him enough to have Arturo investigated for 7 months, he said. 7 months, and I found nothing, but I couldn't clear him either. And during those 7 months, the only person I consulted about investigating Arturo Fiore was Garrett Mulcahy." He said it in the flat voice of a man who had just seen something that had been sitting directly in front of him for 9 months. Marin thought about that half-second at dinner, the glance and then the lowered eyes, and she understood that he didn't need to raise his voice anymore. He hadn't needed to raise it for 9 months, not since the day he'd built a suspect with his own hands, and then sat down beside the hunter to help point the way. Nell Prokop stopped her in the ground-floor hallway the next morning, and she didn't begin with any preamble at all. She simply stood in Marin's path and said, "Do you know what you were just shown?" Marin said, "I know." Nell said, "No, you don't." Then she told her to step into the small study beside the stairs and close the door. She didn't sit down. "I've worked with him for 6 years, Nell said. "I don't like you. I don't need to like you. But I'm not going to let you walk around this house without understanding where you're standing. Because the person who doesn't understand where they're standing is the most dangerous person in the room." Marin said nothing. She'd learned that when someone had already decided to speak, the best thing to do was not interrupt. "That law the attorney read to you that night," Nell said. "Do you remember what he told you?" Marin said. "He didn't tell me anything about the law. He only explained the offer." "Exactly," Nell said, "because there was nothing to explain." She folded her arms. "People like to think spouses can't testify against each other. In federal court, that privilege belongs to the witness, not the person being investigated. It belongs to you. You can use it if you want, or you can waive it if you want. He has no right to decide that for you. On December 14th, you can walk into that courtroom, sit down, and repeat every word you've read on Garrett Mulcahy's lips over the past 5 weeks. And there isn't a law in the world that can stop you. Marin stood perfectly still. This marriage has never protected him from anything, Nell said. Not once. Not for a single day. Then she said the second part. And the second part was the thing she'd actually wanted to say. The federal case is still wide open. 6 weeks ago, you were the 9th line on a timekeeping list. A waitress who carried coffee into that room 38 times and didn't hear anything because the dishwasher was loud. Now you eat dinner at this table. Now you sleep upstairs. Now you sit in his study watching security footage. Nell tilted her head slightly. Do you understand what you've become? 6 weeks ago, you were worth 1 interview. Now you're worth 10 times that. And everyone knows it, except you. She opened the door and walked out, leaving it open behind her. Marin stood in that small room for about 4 minutes. She wasn't afraid. What she felt was something else. Colder. Like the feeling you get when you're carrying a tray and suddenly realize you miscounted a plate 3 tables ago. She went to find him. He was alone in the ground floor study. She closed the door behind her and didn't waste time. This marriage doesn't protect you, she said. Not just now. It never did. You knew that when you sat at the head of that table and told me this was a transaction. Aurelio set down his pen. He didn't ask who had told her. He didn't say she'd misunderstood. He said one word. Yes. Marin felt something tighten inside her chest. Then what did you buy? She said. You paid $180,000 and funded a lifetime trust for someone you've never met in exchange for a piece of paper that doesn't protect you from anything. You're a man who calculates. You don't do meaningless things. So what did you buy? He stood up. He walked to the window, then turned back. 6 weeks ago, you stood in the rain and said one sentence to me, he said. You didn't ask for anything. You didn't wait for me to answer. You turned around, walked back inside, and closed the door. He paused for 1 beat. No one has done that to me in 20 years. Everyone who walks in brings something to sell, and the real price is always in the part where they stay and wait. You didn't stay, Marin said. That doesn't answer my question. It does, he said. He looked at her. I didn't need a law. Laws can be bought, and anything that can be bought by someone else too. I needed to know what kind of person you are, he said the next sentence very slowly. Now I know, because you're asking. Marin stood there, and the past 4 weeks rearranged themselves inside her mind into a different order. The long table, the thin file, the sentence about neither of them having to pretend this was anything other than what it was. She'd thought she'd sat down to a transaction, and in a transaction, both sides knew what they were getting. But he hadn't bought anything at all. He'd placed his entire empire on the table, pushed it toward a waitress he'd met only once in a parking lot, and waited to see what she would do. You're insane, she said. Maybe, he said. You still have 7 weeks before December 14th. Think carefully. Marin kept working. Nell Prokop thought it was foolish and said so plainly, but Aurelio didn't stop her, and Marin kept her regular schedule, 6 shifts a week, because she'd told Nell that if she quit, people would write their own story. And she still believed that. On a Thursday afternoon near the end of October, she was sitting at the small table in the kitchen folding napkins, before opening when Garrett Mulcahy came in through the side door. He had no reason to be in the kitchen at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her without being invited. And he sat in the way of a man who wanted her to know he didn't need an invitation. She kept folding the napkin in her hands. Everything all right at the other house? He said. Marin said it was. He nodded slowly. Your room's on the 2nd floor. East side, right? He said. The one with the window overlooking the back garden. Gets a lot of sun in the morning. Marin set the folded napkin on top of the stack and picked up the next one. I sleep during the day, she said. I don't notice the sun. He smiled. He asked whether it felt strange to go from waiting tables to suddenly sitting down for dinner with the same people she'd spent years serving. She said it did. He asked whether Aurelio talked to her much. She said he was gone most of the time. He asked whether she ever went down to the ground floor, to that study, because Aurelio worked in there all day. She said she didn't go downstairs. It went on that way for about 7 minutes. Every question a small trap set down very gently, and she stepped over each one without touching it. She didn't blink once. She folded 11 napkins in those 7 minutes, and she knew the exact number because she counted. And she counted because counting was what she did when she needed her mind to stay still. At the 8th minute, she set down the napkin and looked up. Mr. Mulcahy, she said, how's your family? It was the first question she'd asked during the entire conversation, and she looked directly at his face when she asked it. He said, fine, thank you. But before the word fine, there was a fraction of a second. Not a second, not half a second, something smaller than that. the tiny interval in which the muscles around his eyes tightened and released before his mouth had time to do its work. Marin had watched thousands of mouths in her life, and she knew that a mouth could lie, but the muscles around the eyes were half a beat slower. "Do you have any brothers or sisters?" she asked. He said one sister. She asked if she lived nearby. He said Dundalk. Then he stood up. "You're a strange woman," he said. "Probably," she said. He left through the side door. Marin sat still until she heard the door close completely. Then she pulled out her order pad and wrote one line, not about the sister, about the muscles around his eyes. 20 minutes later, Dinah Roscoe walked past and stopped beside the napkin table with the shift schedule in her hand. She said she had to rearrange the November schedule because Perla had asked for 2 holidays off, and 2 people on the hotline had already requested leave. She asked whether Marin could take the night of November 20th. It was a Friday, and afterward Marin would get the entire weekend off. 2 full days together, which almost never happened. Marin looked at the schedule. The reason made sense. The date made sense. And the trade was good for her. Dinah added, "I know you usually go to Catonsville on Sundays. With 2 days you'll have more time." Marin said, "Yes, that's fine. Thank you." Dinah nodded, wrote Marin's name into the box for the night of November 20th, and moved on. Marin watched her for a while. 4 years earlier, during the 7 weeks Des had been in the hospital, that same woman had covered Marin's shifts without asking a single question, and without mentioning it even once afterward. There were debts no one ever called in, and no one ever forgot. And Marin carried that debt the way people carried an old key in a coat pocket. Something they didn't use but couldn't bring themselves to throw away. She finished folding the stack of napkins. One other small thing happened that afternoon, and she wrote it in her pad only because she wrote everything down. Beside the delivery door, the card with the instructions for entering the alarm code had been replaced with a new one. She asked the head chef about it. He said the code had been changed the week before, on Friday, 6 days ago. She asked who had the new code. He said 3 people, the owner, the night manager, and the security person on the other side. She wrote 3 small digits in the margin of the page, right beside the line about the muscles around Garrett Mulcahy's eyes, and didn't think anything more about it. 3 weeks later, those would be the most important digits she'd ever written in her life. Aurelio flew to Philadelphia on the morning of Friday, November 20th, with Nell Prokop, and according to the schedule, the 2 of them would return Sunday morning. Marin knew because Nell had given her the week's schedule before leaving, something that had become a habit since the month before, and Marin read it the way she read everything, by putting it into her head and leaving it there. That night, the restaurant closed at 10:30. The last customer left at 10:20. Everyone on the hotline had gone home, leaving only 3 people behind for the end-of-month inventory. Marin, Perla, Quintanilla, and Dinah Roscoe. It was November, and outside, the wind coming in from the harbor was cold and dry. At 11:15, Perla hung up her apron, and Marin heard Dinah speaking on the phone in the back hallway. She spoke briefly, her voice low, and Marin caught only 3 words, "I don't know," then silence. Later, people would learn that at 11:15 that night, Dinah Roscoe had called Nell Prokop's number, and no one answered because Nell was on an airplane, and that Dinah had left a 19-second voicemail in which she couldn't bring herself to say a single name, a single address, or a single time, only that something might happen at the restaurant tonight, and you should call me back. But that night, no one knew any of it. At 11:23, the power went out. Not in the entire building, only the east half. The kitchen, the dry storage room, the back hallway, the delivery door. The lights in the front dining room stayed on. Marin was standing in the dishwashing area, and in the exact instant the darkness fell, she didn't think about burglars. She didn't think about an electrical fault. She thought about the 3rd switch from the top in the breaker box in the back hallway, the one Perla had shown her in September. And she knew that to shut down exactly the east half, someone had to be standing in front of that box and know which switch to flip. She went straight to Perla. The older woman was fumbling around for her purse. Marin took hold of her arm. "Go out the front door right now," she said. Perla asked what was wrong. Marin said, "Go out the front door, walk, and don't come back for anything." She dug a few coins from her apron pocket and pressed them into Perla's hand. "Call the police," Perla said. "The store on the corner. It closes at 11 now," Marin said. "Go 4 more blocks, to the gas station. It's open all night." Perla looked at her for 1 second in the dark, and she didn't ask another question. 16 years of working in that building had taught her when to ask and when to go. She stepped out through the front door, onto the sidewalk, and started walking. 58 years old. A November night. 4 blocks. She made it out. Marin stood at the front door and watched until Perla disappeared around the corner. Then she turned back inside. She could have followed her. Later, she would think about that moment more than any other moment in her life. The instant she stood in the doorway with the empty sidewalk in front of her and darkness behind her, she went back in because Dinah was still inside. She crossed the dining room, entered the hallway, and called out, "Dinah." There was no answer. She called a second time, louder, "Dinah." Still nothing. She stopped in the dark hallway and listened. No footsteps, no door, no sound of anyone breathing. The building where she'd worked for 4 years, a building whose every sound she knew, was completely silent. She took out her phone, called Nell Prokop, and it went straight to voicemail. She called Aurelio. The same thing. She looked at the time on the screen, 11:38. Then, she heard the delivery door. Not the sound of someone forcing it, not the sound of a kick. The sound of the handle turning slowly and the door opening the way it opened when someone had done this many times before, pushing it only as far as necessary, holding it so the hinges wouldn't make a sound, keeping the door from swinging wide. Marin turned off her phone screen and slipped it into her apron pocket. She backed 3 steps into the dishwashing area and pressed her back against the cold section of wall between the dishwasher and the rack holding the tubs. Then she began to count. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere in her mind was a garage in Dundalk, the smell of sandpaper and machine oil, an old dog curled beside an electric heater, and the voice of a 76-year-old man coming out of the darkness. 2 minutes. You stand in darkness for 2 minutes. Your eyes open up, and you see what they don't. They come in from the light. They'll be blind for 6 seconds. Those 6 seconds belong to you. She counted to 40 and saw nothing. She counted to 60 and still saw nothing. There were footsteps. 2 people, maybe 3, spreading out. She counted to 80. Then, somewhere around 90, the kitchen began to emerge. The steel edge of the prep table, the frame of the dry storage door, the rolling rack for baking trays standing in the corner where it had always stood. For 9 years, she'd stood in the dark inside a garage in Dundalk and counted to 120. For 9 years, she'd never once needed to use it. The first man entered the dishwashing area at the 118th second. Marin heard his breathing before she heard his footsteps, and she knew he was scanning straight ahead, toward the open space between the 2 steel tables, because that was where people always looked when they entered a dark room. She didn't step back to the right. People stepped back to the right. That was what the body did on its own when no one had taught it otherwise, and Gus Pryor had spent nearly a year teaching her to do the opposite. One Saturday morning after another, until her feet remembered, and her mind no longer needed to know. She stepped back to the left, into the narrow space behind the open door, and he passed her less than 3.5 feet away, close enough that she heard the rhythm of his breathing change when he saw the room was empty. He took one more step. Every bit of his attention was focused forward. She kicked the back of his left knee. It wasn't a beautiful kick, and it wasn't meant to be beautiful. Don't strike to finish it. Strike to change the situation. He pitched forward, and both hands flew out to catch the floor, and hands that were bracing against the floor were no longer at his belt, and that was exactly the amount of time she needed. She followed him down, controlling the momentum of the fall exactly the way she'd practiced on the old mat, spread across the concrete floor, except this time there was tile beneath them instead of a mat. There were 4 plastic zip ties in the pocket of his vest. It took her about 3 seconds to pull them out, and she used them on him, and as she did, one very clear and very strange thought passed through her mind, that people carried zip ties to bind someone else, and no one ever carried zip ties to bind themselves. The second man came from the direction of the dry storage room, and from his first 2 steps, she knew he was different. He didn't hurry. He didn't call out his partner's name. He stopped to listen before moving again, and when he caught her left wrist, the grip had the weight of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly how much force he needed. Marin didn't pull away. 9 years earlier, in a garage in Dundalk, an old man had wrapped his hand around her wrist and tightened his grip, and she'd pulled against him by instinct, and he'd released her and said, "You can't beat me with strength. Follow the force. Let it take you where you want to go." She followed the force. She turned in the exact direction he was pulling her, and the turn brought her inside his reach instead of away from it, and she drove the heel of her right palm upward. He staggered. He didn't fall. She needed 3 seconds. And she didn't have 3 seconds. But behind him, about 1 step away, stood the rolling rack for baking trays. Marin had pushed that rack 12 hours a day for 4 years. She knew how heavy it was when it was full, and how heavy it was when it was empty. She knew the rear wheel on the right side jammed, and that every time you pushed it, you had to angle slightly to the left. She knew it stood half a head taller than she did, and she knew exactly which way it would fall if someone shoved the upper left edge. She didn't push him. She planted both hands against the rack and pushed. There was one enormous crash of metal, followed by the sound of dozens of baking trays hitting the tile floor, the noise going on for several seconds before slowly fading into silence. He was underneath it, and he didn't get back up. Maren straightened, breathing hard, and in the silence after the last tray stopped moving, she heard a third set of footsteps. From the direction of the dining room, from the front entrance. She'd counted 2. There were 3. For a fraction of a second, she felt the full weight of that mistake come down on her, the mistake that had begun when she'd pressed her back against the wall and counted footsteps in the darkness. And she understood that she'd counted the men coming through the delivery door without accounting for the possibility that someone had entered through another door. Then the old man's voice cut through her mind. When you make a mistake, don't waste time on the mistake. Spend your time on what comes next. She turned, took 3 steps to the control panel, mounted on the wall beside the cooking line, and pulled the red lever. The kitchen fire suppression system activated within half a second. White chemical powder blasted from the nozzles in the ceiling, swallowing the entire hotline in a thick curtain. The alarm screamed at a piercing pitch, and the exhaust fans above the hood roared at full power. The whole room became something no one could see through, and no one could hear inside. Maren dropped low, almost to her knees, and moved along the lower edge of the row of steel tables. She'd cleaned that edge 6 shifts a week for 4 years. She knew where a screw stuck out, where there was a gap wide enough to slip a shoulder through, where the table ended and the refrigerated drawer unit began. She moved through the cloud of white powder without needing to see, because she didn't need to see. The man coming from the front entrance did. She came out of the cloud of white powder at the far end of the row of steel tables and entered the dining room, where the alarm sounded quieter and the air was still clear. She found him in the farthest corner, in the space between the reception counter and the wall where the board listing the day's specials hung. He stood with his back pressed against the wall, both hands raised to shoulder height, and he wasn't holding anything. That was the first thing Maren noticed. The first man and the second had both carried something at their belts. This one had nothing in his hands, and nothing at his waist, and the 2 hands he was holding up were the hands of someone who had raised them on his own, not someone who had been forced to. The second thing she noticed was that he was very young. The third thing, and this was what made her stop, was that his face wasn't the face of someone who did this for a living. She'd waited on thousands of people over 4 years, and she knew the look of someone who was afraid was different from the look of someone who was calculating. This was the first kind. Maren pulled her phone from her apron pocket and turned on the flashlight, shining it into his face. He narrowed his eyes and turned his head slightly away. She spoke, and she used exactly the same calm voice she used when repeating an order back to a customer before taking it into the kitchen. A voice that neither rose nor fell, steady as someone reading from a list. Burger, no onions, extra fries. You sat in the 3rd seat from the outside. Thursday, 3 weeks ago. You paid in change, and you apologized for paying in change. For about 3 seconds afterward, nothing happened. Then he slid down the wall and sat on the floor, his hands still half raised, as though they'd forgotten they were supposed to come down. He let out a sound that almost sounded like a laugh, but wasn't. They told me no one would be in here, he said. They told you a lot of things, Maren said. She turned off the flashlight. The alarm was still screaming from the kitchen. She walked behind the reception counter, took a glass, poured water from the pitcher there, and brought it back to him. He stared at the glass for a moment before taking it. What's your name? She asked. Emery, he said. Emery Frick. She asked how old he was. 22. He drank half the glass and set it on the floor beside his foot, and his hand was shaking badly enough that water spilled over the rim. They told me to stand by the front door, he said. Not to come inside, not to do anything. Just stand out there, and if anyone came by, tell them the restaurant was closed because of electrical repairs. $300. He looked down at the floor. Then I heard something inside, so I came in. I didn't know. I thought. He didn't finish the sentence. Maren reached into the outside pocket of his coat. He didn't resist. Inside were 2 plastic zip ties, the same kind as the 4 she'd found in the first man's vest. She took one out. He looked at it, then at her. They gave me those, he said, but they didn't tell me what they were for. Maren didn't answer. She told him to put his hands out in front of him, and he did. And she did what she had to do, and he didn't struggle even once. When she was finished, she sat down in a chair at table 4, about 6.5 feet away from him, and the 2 of them sat there in silence while the alarm kept screaming. Outside, Toward the main road, there were still no sirens. She thought about Perla, 58 years old, walking through a November night, 4 blocks, maybe already at the gas station, maybe not yet. She thought about Dinah Roscoe and how she'd called her name twice in the dark hallway and no one had answered. And she pushed that thought aside because she didn't yet have the strength to look directly at it. She stood, went back into the kitchen through the cloud of powder that had begun to settle, shut off the alarm system, and in the sudden silence afterward, she could hear very clearly the exhaust fans slowing down. She checked the first man, still breathing, awake, looking at her with an expression she didn't bother trying to read. She checked the second man, still breathing. She pulled 2 baking trays away from where he lay and finished doing what needed to be done with him, and she did it carefully, because a very long time ago she'd promised an old man in Dundalk that if the day ever came when she had to use the things he'd taught her, she would never do more than was necessary. Then she went outside, sat down on the stool beside the kitchen door, the same stool where she'd rested her feet between shifts for the past 4 years, and only then, when there was nothing left to do, did she look down at her 2 hands and see that they were shaking. She let her hands shake until they stopped. Then she pulled out her order pad and began writing. 3 men. Estimated height, gait, dominant hand, voice. The way the second man had stopped to listen before moving again. The way the first one breathed. She wrote while the details were still fresh because she knew memories of things like this decayed very quickly, much faster than people thought. When she turned to a fresh page, a piece of paper slipped out of the pad and slid onto the floor. She picked it up. The purple fish with 4 legs, folded in half. One corner dusted with white chemical powder. She brushed the powder away with the back of her hand, folded it again along the old crease, and tucked it back between the pages of the pad. Then she kept writing. At 5 minutes past midnight, 2 cars stopped outside, and 4 of Nell Prokop's people came in through the front door. The man in front looked at the dining room, looked at Emery Frick sitting on the floor, then went into the kitchen, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for quite a while without saying anything. 6 minutes later, at 11 minutes past midnight, 2 police cars arrived. Perla Quintanilla had made it to the gas station. She'd walked all 4 blocks. Marin knew when one of the officers mentioned the woman who had called it in, and she sat down in the chair again because her legs suddenly refused to keep her standing. While everyone else did what they had to do, Marin went into the back hallway and stood in front of the delivery door. She turned on the flashlight on her phone and examined the frame, the hinges, the lock, the aluminum edge where the door met the frame. There were no pry marks, no gouges. Not a single chip of paint had come loose. The lock was intact. She moved the light to the alarm keypad mounted on the inside wall, the new instruction card still too fresh to look worn, and she stood there looking at it for a long time. When Nell Prokop arrived, close to 1 o'clock in the morning, Marin didn't wait for her to ask anything. She asked first, when was the alarm code changed? Nell looked at her. Late last month, she said. About 3 weeks ago. Who has the new code? Marin asked. 3 people, Nell said. Him, the night manager, and security. Marin didn't say anything else. She went back to the stool beside the kitchen door and sat down, and for the next 3 hours, she barely moved, answering the police when they asked questions, signing where they told her to sign, and thinking about the 3 small digits she'd written in the margin of her order pad 3 weeks earlier, the night Garrett Mulcahy had sat across from her at the napkin folding table and asked about the east bedroom on the 2nd floor. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Aurelio Ferrante came back. She heard the car first, then the door, then footsteps in the dining room. He walked into the kitchen. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask whether she was all right. Didn't ask who had arrived first. Didn't ask what the police had said. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked. He looked at the 3 men. He looked at the rolling baking rack lying on its side across the tile floor with dozens of trays scattered around it. He looked at the white powder still coating the steel tables and the shoulders of everyone in the room. He looked for a long time, and Marin realized he was reading the room the same way she read a mouth, reading to understand rather than to react. Then he pulled over a second stool, sat down across from her, and asked, "Who taught you?" "An old man in Dundalk," she said. "Since when?" "Since I was 18, she said. 9 years. He didn't say anything. "I've never had to use any of it before," she said. Aurelio Ferrante looked down at the floor, 34 years old, sitting on a kitchen stool in a restaurant at 4 o'clock in the morning, and the head of the Ferrante family stared at the white powder covering the tile like a man recounting something he'd gotten wrong a long time ago. "I brought you into this without telling you who was inside this house," he said. Marin didn't answer immediately. She thought of the kind answers. "You couldn't have known. It's over now. and she discarded all of them. Yes, she said. You did. He nodded once. He accepted it and didn't push it somewhere else. And Maren filed that away somewhere in her mind, because she'd met very few people in her life who could do that. What do you want to know first? She asked. Anything, he said. Your choice. There are no signs of forced entry at the delivery door, she said. He looked up. And the alarm code was changed 3 weeks ago. 3 people have the new code. The kitchen went silent. Somewhere beyond the front door, someone spoke briefly into a radio, then stopped. Aurelio Ferrante sat very still, his right hand turning the ring on his little finger, and he said 3 words, not to her but to himself. Only 3 people. Nell's people found Dinah Roscoe at 5:15 in the morning, at her house, sitting in the kitchen with her coat still on and the lights off. She hadn't run. They brought her back to the restaurant, and Maren met her in the staff room at the front, the 2 of them sitting on opposite sides of the small table where, for 4 years, they'd sat at the end of each shift to count tips. Maren asked only one question. Did you give the code to anyone? Dinah Roscoe looked down at the floor. Yes, she said. Then she told her, and she told the entire thing in one uninterrupted stream, like someone who'd been rehearsing those words inside her head for months and had only been waiting for someone to ask. Her daughter was 23 years old, and 3 years earlier she'd fallen into gambling debt, and the man who paid that debt was Garrett Mulcahy. He never asked for the money back. He never asked for money at all. He only asked small questions from time to time. Who was in private room 2 that day? Who had reservations for the following week? Who was working which night shift? 3 years, nothing but small questions. Then last month he asked for the new alarm code, and she gave it to him. And she was the one who changed the shift schedule. Maren asked, "Why me?" Dinah said because he'd told her to schedule Maren for the night of November 20th. She looked up for the first time. She said he'd told her that all they were coming for that night was the safe in the office, that it would take 15 minutes, and that they needed one person to remain behind to open the front door if anything happened. She said she'd believed him. Then that evening, at 11 o'clock, she looked through the hallway window and saw one of the 3 men take a plastic canister out of the car. Maren said nothing. Dinah said she'd called Nell Prokop at 11:15. She said she'd called. No one answered. She left a message, and she hadn't dared say any names or any times. She'd only said that something might happen at the restaurant that night, and then she'd gone out the front door and left. She said she'd stood on the corner for 10 minutes. She said she'd meant to go back. Maren remembered standing in the dark hallway and calling Dinah's name twice. Dinah hadn't come back. Maren sat in silence for quite a long time. Then she said, "Go sit in the other room. Don't call anyone. I'll decide what happens after I speak with him." Dinah stood and went into that room, and at the doorway she stopped and said, "4 years ago, I covered your shifts for 7 weeks. Maren said, "I know, and that's why you're sitting in that room instead of somewhere else." At 7 o'clock in the morning, Arturo Fiore arrived. He came before everyone else who had been called, and Maren noticed that. She stopped him in the hallway before he could enter the dining room. She'd spent 2 hours rearranging everything inside her head, and now she was certain. 3 people had the code. Dinah was one. Security had been checked. That left one person outside that list who'd been close enough to everything for the past 9 months. And he was the only person in the house who had treated her with too much politeness from the very first dinner. "You know what's happening," she said. Arturo Fiore didn't ask what she meant. He didn't smile, didn't deny it, didn't raise his hands. He simply looked at her, and that look was older than any look she'd received in the past 2 months. "I've known about Garrett since June," he said. Maren stood perfectly still. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "Because if I'd said something in June," he said, "he would have only lost his job." He paused for one beat. "I wanted him to lose everything." The hallway was very quiet. Maren looked at him and realized she was looking at something she would think about for a very long time. Longer even than she would think about what had happened in the kitchen the night before. He hadn't betrayed anyone. He hadn't given anyone the code, hadn't called anyone, hadn't taken a single dollar from anyone. He had simply sat still for 5 months and waited. And he'd known that for a man to lose everything, something large enough had to happen first. And he'd accepted that the price of that happening might be paid with someone else's life. "Did you know who was in the kitchen last night?" she asked. "No," he said. "And if you had known?" Arturo Fiore didn't answer that question. He walked past her and into the dining room. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the police were gone. Nell's people had finished cleaning the kitchen, and someone had set the rolling baking rack upright again in its old place in the corner. Maren went into the kitchen and found Perla Quintanilla standing at the small stove, her apron tied neatly around her waist, stirring a pot over the flame. No one had called her in. She'd taken the bus there on her own at 7 o'clock. She didn't ask whether Marin was all right. She didn't ask what had happened the night before. She took a bowl from the shelf, filled it, set it on the steel counter in front of Marin, placed a spoon beside it, and said 2 words. "Sit down." Marin sat. She ate half the bowl, then set down the spoon and asked Perla a question no one had ever asked her in 16 years of working in that building. "Perla, what have you seen?" Perla Quintanilla wiped her hands on her apron. She pulled over the second stool, sat down across from Marin, and began to tell her. The next morning, at 8 o'clock, in the Ferrante dining room, Aurelio sat at the head of the table. Nell Prokop stood beside the door. Marin sat in the chair against the wall, not at the table, and no one had told her where to sit. She had chosen that place herself, because from there she could see both the mouth and both hands of the man who was about to walk in. Garrett Mulcahy arrived exactly on time. He entered wearing a perfect expression. He said he'd heard what happened the night before, said he'd called 3 times and no one had answered, asked whether anyone had been hurt, said he'd been telling them for 2 years that the restaurant's alarm system needed to be replaced. He spoke for 2 straight minutes, in exactly the rhythm of a man who was genuinely concerned, neither too fast nor too slow, even placing one carefully measured hesitation in the middle. Aurelio let him perform the entire 2 minutes. Then he said 4 words. "Teddy is next door." Marin was watching Mulcahy's right hand resting on the table. Nothing happened on his face. Not a single muscle moved, and she had to admit it was one of the finest displays of control she'd ever seen. But that right hand flattened, only slightly. A tension passed through the tendons on the back of it and disappeared. The kind of reaction that happened when the story inside a man's head collided with a fact outside it, and the two didn't match. She saw it. Mulcahy sat still for about 4 seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair, and the concerned expression fell away, not gradually, but all at once, the way someone sets a tray down on a table. He didn't deny anything. He didn't cry. He spoke in the rough voice that 7 men in Private Room 2 had heard for years. 19 years I spent building that transportation operation from 3 rusted trucks, he said. I sat out at the port through the winter of 1998, when no one else would go out there. I buried people for this family. Your father called me his brother. Do you know how many people heard him call me that? He looked at Aurelio. Then some waitress walks in through the back door, and in 9 weeks she's standing closer to you than I did in 19 years. Aurelio didn't interrupt him. He let him finish. Then he said, You always had my ear. Mulcahy said, No, not anymore. Not since she came. Aurelio said, Did you build that transportation operation, or did you bleed it dry? Mulcahy went silent. It was the first time that morning he'd gone silent. Nell Prokop placed a file on the table. During the night, her people had opened the safe in the Cormorant restaurant office, the safe the 3 men had come to take before burning everything else. And inside were the original records for the port transportation operation, 6 years of handwritten books that could be matched against every single shipment, $2.4 million. Not taken all at once. Over 6 years, one amount at a time, steady as a heartbeat. Marin sat in the chair against the wall and understood something she would return to many times afterward. The night before, she hadn't saved anyone. She hadn't known what was inside that safe. She'd never opened it. She'd never known it contained anything other than the cash from the end of each shift. She had simply refused to let that room burn. And the one thing in the world capable of convicting Garrett Mulcahy had been sitting there for 6 years, 12 steps from the place where she folded napkins. Nell said the file would be turned over to the federal authorities that day. It implicated one man, and that man wasn't Ferrante. Mulcahy looked at the papers. Then he let out a short, dry laugh. He turned toward Aurelio and threw his final blow. Before you start thinking you're so noble, he said, ask who signed the papers that got that girl hired at the Cormorant 4 years ago. Ask. Then go ask her whether she knows. The room went silent. Marin didn't move. She didn't understand what he meant, and she knew that she would, and she knew that when she did, it would hurt. Aurelio Ferrante picked up his phone, dialed a number, and said 3 words. Take him away. The door opened. 2 men came in. Garrett Mulcahy stood and didn't resist, and he buttoned his gray wool coat in exactly the same way he'd buttoned it before every Tuesday dinner for years. At the doorway, he stopped. He didn't turn toward Aurelio. He turned toward the chair against the wall. I told you I didn't know what the hell you were, he said. Marin stood. She looked directly at him and spoke in the same flat voice she used when repeating an order, the voice that neither rose nor fell. Now you know. He held her gaze for one more beat. Then he walked out, and the 2 men followed him, and the door closed, and Marin stood there listening to the footsteps fade until there was nothing left to hear. That afternoon, Marin called Gus Pryor. He answered on the third ring, the way he always did, saying only his last name as though every call were official business. "It's me," she said. "I know it's you," he said. She was quiet for a while, and in that silence he didn't ask whether she was all right, didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask where she was. He asked one question. "What happened to your hand?" Marin looked down at the back of her right hand, where the chemical powder had eaten into the skin and left a red patch that still hadn't healed. "How do you know?" she said. "Because I know you would have had to reach up high and to the right to get it there," he said. "The red lever on a kitchen fire suppression panel is mounted higher than a normal reach." She sat down on the front steps. "I counted wrong," she said. "There were 3 of them. I counted 2. "And what did you do then?" he asked. "I changed the situation," she said. The other end of the line was silent for a very long time. She could hear the electric heater in the garage, barrel shifting on the concrete floor, and the breathing of a 76-year-old man sitting very still. "Then you didn't count wrong," Gus said. "You just hadn't finished counting yet." Marin closed her eyes. Then she asked him the question she'd been carrying inside her chest for 20 hours, ever since Garrett Mulcahy had stopped in the doorway and thrown his final blow. 4 years ago, that job at the Cormorant. "Who did you call?" Gus Pryor didn't ask her to repeat the question. He didn't evade it. "I called someone I knew from my insurance days," he said. "That restaurant belongs to the Ferrante family. At the time, you'd been out of work at the diner on Eastern Street for 5 weeks. You couldn't pay that month's bills, and you hadn't said a word to me. I called. I asked them to give you a place. I only asked for the job. You kept it for 4 years because of you, not because of anyone else." Marin sat in silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because you wouldn't have taken it," he said. "And back then, you needed the job more than you needed your pride." She wanted to be angry with him. She'd been preparing that anger for 20 hours. But sitting on the steps, with the phone pressed to her ear, she thought about the apartment in Highlandtown, about the second drawer, about the bills arranged by due date, and she realized he was right, and she let the anger go. In the middle of December, Aurelio placed a small box on the kitchen table and said nothing. Inside was her father's pocket watch, the watch he had never carried in his pocket, the watch Marin had pawned at a shop on Eastern Street 3 years earlier to pay part of the hospital bills, and had never had the courage to go back and look at again. She picked it up, and it was exactly as heavy as she remembered. Beneath it was the old receipt. She read it and stood there for a very long time. The item had been redeemed 3 years earlier. The name of the person who redeemed it was G. Pryor. She looked up at Aurelio, and he didn't explain. But she understood on her own, because she always understood on her own. That was what she did. He'd been looking for that watch since October, since the night she'd mentioned it exactly once in the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning. He'd tracked down the pawn shop, he'd read the name on the receipt, and he'd had to drive down to Dundalk and ask a 76-year-old man to give it back. "What did he make you do?" she asked. "Sand the hull of the boat," he said. 2 hours. Then he agreed to talk to me. On the morning of December 20th, fog rose from Chesapeake Bay and swallowed Dundalk. The garage door was raised. The fluorescent lights were on. Beryl lay curled near the electric heater and didn't bother lifting his head. Gus Pryor handed Aurelio Ferrante a piece of sandpaper and said 2 words. "Sit down." The 2 men sat on opposite sides of the wooden boat and sanded, and they didn't say much. And whatever little they did say, Marin couldn't hear because she stood in the garage doorway with a cup of coffee in her hand, and the fog swallowed most of the sound. She stood there for a long time. She thought about 27 years of being the person no one bothered to notice. 27 years of standing at the edge of every room, remembering the orders of people who didn't remember her face, and she thought that perhaps it had been the greatest advantage of her life all along, and that she wouldn't trade away a single piece of it. Not the night shifts, not the bus rides, not even the hardest years, because every piece of it had led her to this exact garage on this exact December morning. People often mistake silence for emptiness. A person who doesn't speak much isn't a person with nothing to say, and someone standing at the edge of a room isn't someone who sees nothing. A person's dignity isn't found in how they're treated. It's found in the fact that they remain kind even when no one is watching, that they keep their word even when no one can check, that they turn back for someone else even when the way out is right in front of them. And perhaps the thing most worth thinking about is this: the person who carries your plates, the person washing dishes behind you, the person cleaning the floor after you've gone home. They see everything. They always see everything. It's just that no one has ever bothered to ask them a question. Ask them. Now you know. If this story touched something inside you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so that every day we can keep finding more stories worth hearing together. How do you feel about Marin? About what she chose to do in that dark kitchen that night? And has there ever been someone in your life who underestimated you and later had to think again? Leave a comment. We truly want to hear what you feel from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.